Okay, you'll hear from Sean that similar tweaking with these switches that surround genes provides a very flexible method for evolution to use to create major changes, morphological changes in particular body regions, but still preserve the overall viability, the coding region, and the expression of the genes in other tissues. Okay, I've gone through limb reduction in some detail. I think it's a great sort of trait. It's evolved repeatedly in lots of different animals. It's an example of a sort of macroevolutionary change that's seen in whales and manatees. And it's a kind of trait now where evolutionary studies have made it possible to document major morphological change that occurs in naturally occurring species, to trace those changes through the fossil record, to track down the number and the location of the chromosome regions that control the morphological differences, to identify specific genes that normally build the corresponding morphological structure, and to study how those genes have changed in natural populations. So we now know a lot more about the detailed molecular mechanisms that control these sorts of traits than we did at the time that Darwin wrote, but the details and the additional data that come from many fields all support the key original idea of descent with modification. That's exactly what's supposed to happen with a good scientific theory. Science should fundamentally both explain existing data and make predictions. As we've seen, Darwin predicted that the Earth must be old, that transitional fossils must have existed in the past, that variants must be able to arise and spread through populations, and that very different organisms must be related to one another. Every one of those predictions has been resoundingly confirmed by all kinds of independent data from physics, from geology, from paleontology, from genetics, from biochemistry, from molecular biology, and from embryology. That's why evolution is regarded as a well-established fact by scientists, and that's why we consider it a key organizing principle for understanding all of biology and the interrelationships between living forms. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Yeah?
How do major changes in the gene structure, like the addition of new chromosomes or reduction of chromosomes that you can see in different animals that have different number of chromosomes, how do those take place?
There's lots of different mechanisms that can alter DNA sequence. Sean mentioned single base pair changes that can occur by errors of replication during cell replication. That occurs randomly and will just alter individual base pairs. There's also transposable elements that will hop around. There's also gene duplication events that take place. In fact, we now have genome sequences of lots of different animals, and you can see how whole gene sections have been duplicated, creating new regions. We think that those kinds of mechanisms provide a flexible basis of generating the kinds of genetic variation that underlies the things that evolution can do to produce new alterations in morphology. Shouldn't just go to one side of the room. Yeah?
My name's Andrew. In the example of the Drosophila with the extra eye on its leg, did that eye work, and did it affect the working of the two regular eyes on its head?
So remarkably, that extra eye spot is actually innervated. And if you shine light on the leg of the fly and record from the neurons that project to that ectopic eye patch, they respond to the light. So it's a remarkably semi-functional eye that not only has the right lens proteins and photoreceptors, but actually is innervated, will respond to light and stimulate electrical activity. Down to the last of the T-shirts here. Yeah.
I want to go back to Darwin for a second. You said before that in the last paragraph of his book, Darwin mentioned a creator. And I was just wondering why so many religious figures and groups of people who are religious even today react so negatively to Darwin's theories, even though he clearly, or at least pretended to clearly, still believe in a creator.
So we'll talk more about that this afternoon. The point I'd like to make is that, in fact, most major religious groups in the world don't see a conflict between evolution and religion, including the Pope himself, who looks at the same data that I summarized here and says this is independent data that overwhelmingly supports the theory of evolution. There's not a conflict between the idea that life has been modified, generated by a process of evolution and descent with modification. That's a separate issue from where the universe originally came from and what set everything off at the beginning. The Bible also doesn't say how God created things. It says it all came from dust. That's not so different than an evolutionary model where from very simple beginnings, life forms are generated by descent with modification. Yeah.
You talked about how the fossil record earlier. You found earlier in the fossil record that you found the single-celled microorganisms. But how do you go around looking for single-celled microorganisms in fossils when there's so many rocks on Earth and they're so tiny?
That's actually why that gap in the fossil record existed for a long time, because it wasn't clear how to recognize the early forms of life on Earth. One of the real breakthroughs came from a realization that sometimes these single-celled microorganisms will accumulate in large mats. So you can actually see this today off the western coast of Australia. There's these structures called stromatolite. Stromatolite-like structures, which are these big mat-like forms of cyanobacteria that form, and they're big enough that they actually make a giant kind of mushroom that's just full of bacteria. So those forms can be seen today, and those are the structures that were first recognized in the fossil record. Very similar sorts of accumulations, incredibly high density, all laid out in little chains and mats, just like you would see today in a modern structure off of Australia. These bacteria still exist in the world today, and they can be recognized in the fossil record originally because of that unusual grouping of them. And then once it was clear that those things existed, you could begin looking for more and more rocks that had the characteristics that they would have been laid down in the kind of nearshore environments where those structures are formed. I think this is my last T-shirt, but I hope that doesn't mean the end of the question. Yeah.
I was wondering if they've been able to trace the evolution of viruses as well, and possibly when viruses first came into existence from specific tissues.
So there's lots of work when new diseases break out. There's lots of questions about where the disease organism came from. So that's looked at by sequencing the virus and trying to see how it's related to other known viruses. As patients are treated with drugs, drug-resistant forms of the virus will emerge within the body, a dramatic example of evolution occurring in medicine. Again, if you sequence the genome of the viruses that have emerged in a patient that's being treated with drugs, you can see individual base pair changes that have occurred within the virus that are part of the evolution of drug resistance. So in fact, the strategies that doctors use to try to suppress viral infections are heavily based on the idea of trying to minimize the chance that viral-resistant forms will pop out and spread. The best way to do that is to treat patients with multiple drugs simultaneously so that even if a single base pair change occurs, there's some other drug that is inhibiting multiple parts of the virus independently and keep the infection squashed down. Okay, thanks very much. Those were great questions, and I'll turn things back over to Tom.
Thank you, David Kingsley, for an outstanding talk. We're going to break now for half an hour. When we return, Sean Carroll will conclude our journey of evolution by talking about human fossils and also human genetics.